Listen, if you were a Klickitat man in the year 1888, standing on a low bank a mile above the rapids at the place the white men were starting to call Cascade Locks, and the water was low and the summer was dry, and you looked down into the current where it slowed and went clear over the shallows, you would see them. Trees, not driftwood, not branches caught on rocks, whole trees. Douglas fir and cedar, dozens of them, hundreds, standing straight up on the river bottom, roots still holding, tops broken off, bark long gone. A forest under the river, fish moving through the branches where owls had once been. There's a piece of testimony from that year, or close to it, taken down by a young man named Frederick Balk at White Salmon, Washington. An old Klickitat man, name not recorded, told him what his father had once told him. When his father was a boy, his mother paddled him upstream in a canoe. They came to the Tomanoas Bridge. She paddled the canoe underneath it. It was all dark. He looked up and could not see the sun. The roof of stone shut it out. The boy was afraid. She paddled quickly. He never forgot how it looked. Now, hold that. Hold the darkness inside the canoe, the stone above, the boy looking up. Because everything else in this story hangs on what that old man was actually describing. Not a metaphor, not a fable, not a Victorian romance about a fallen princess. Something else, something older, something that leaves a forest standing at the bottom of a river. For the next hour, I want to take you into a piece of American land that most people think they know and show you what was actually there. Not the postcard version, not the tourism version, the Klickitat version. What the people who lived on this river said was underneath it, and why, 500 years later, science had to admit they had been right the whole time. And I want to show you the other thing too, the thing that got layered on top. The story a young missionary's son wrote in his fever, and how his novel became the ancient native legend printed on every brochure at the visitor center. Two stories, running side by side along the same water. Only one of them is Klickitat. Let me start with who they are, because that matters, and it is the piece the postcards leave out first. The Klickitat call themselves Xwalxwepam. Some write it Kulhuaypum. It means, in their own language, prairie people. Their Yakama neighbors also called them Latiksat. They lived, and they still live, along the highlands north of the Middle Columbia, at the headwaters of 4 rivers that drain into it. The Cowlitz, the Lewis, the White Salmon, and the river that now carries their name, the country of oak groves and Kama's meadows on the shoulder of Mount Adams. They are, and this is important, still here. Most of them today are enrolled with the confederated tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation, on a reservation in south central Washington that covers roughly 1.2 million acres. A smaller number are enrolled with the confederated tribes of the Grand Ronde community in Oregon. Their language, Itishkeen, is being taught again to children at Heritage University in Toppenish and at the University of Oregon. It never died. It was pushed down, it came back up. When you hear the word Sahaptin, that is what linguists call the language family, but it isn't what the Klickitat call it. Sahaptin is a Salish word meaning stranger in the land. The Yakama Nation's Cultural Resources Office prefers Itishkeen Sinuit, which just means this language, the way we speak. A small detail, big correction. If you're going to talk about a people, use the words they use for themselves. Now, the river. In English, it is the Columbia. That name is 134 years old at the time of this recording. Robert Gray, a Boston fur trader, crossed the bar in May of 1792 in a ship called the Columbia Rediviva. He gave the river the name of his ship. That was the entire ceremony. The name stuck because his patrons in Boston had money, and because his patrons in Boston printed maps. Before that, and after that, and still now, the Klickitat and their Sahaptin-speaking neighbors called it something else. Inchiwana, which means in Itishkeen, the great river, not the biggest river they knew of, the great one, the one. There is only one Inchiwana, and on the middle stretch of Inchiwana, in a narrow place where the water turned white and the mountains squeezed the current down into a 2-mile gauntlet of rock, there was, according to their oldest stories, a bridge, a stone bridge, not built, not carved, placed there, something you could walk across, something people once walked across without their feet getting wet. That is a documented tradition, not something I am reaching for. The elders said it, explorers wrote it down, ethnographers heard it repeated across 5 generations. There is variation, as there always is with oral history, but the core survives everywhere it was recorded. The river had once been closed. There had been a way across without a canoe, and the way across had fallen in. That is Act 1 of what the Klickitat knew. What they knew was geological. What they knew was true. Now imagine what it took to preserve that memory, because I want you to sit with this for a moment. You are a people without writing. Everything you know about the land you have been given by your grandmother, and she was given it by hers. somewhere back in the chain of grandmothers. One of them stood on this river when it was choked. She saw it, or her mother did. And then, without ink, without paper, without a single archive in the European sense of the word, that memory was carried across 500 years. And it arrived in the 1880s still specific enough that an old man could describe the darkness inside the canoe. That is not primitive, that is engineering of memory, a structure as precise, in its own way, as anything Rome built. The Klickitat did not tell the story as a curiosity. They told it because it explained what the river was doing now. The reason Nchiwana boiled through Cascade Rapids for 1.5 miles in a way it did not boil anywhere else on its lower course. The reason there was a broken staircase of basalt at that exact point. The reason there were trees standing upright in the water where no forest could grow. Because a mountain had fallen, and the bridge that once stood there had come down. They said this, they said it consistently. They said it before white men had any tools capable of proving it. Elsewhere on the river, other Sahaptin-speaking peoples had their own testimony about the same event. The Wasco, upstream, had memory of a lake that once reached almost as far as Wallula Gap, 170 miles inland, a lake caused by the choking of the river at the Cascades. Chinookan peoples at the actual rapids, especially the Watlala band, had ceremonial names for the site. Tamanawas, in Chinook jargon, is the word for guardian spirit. That was the name of the fallen bridge in some tellings. The Tamanawas Bridge, the Guardian Bridge. Others called it Tanmahawis, or in Balkis spelling, Tamanawas. The word doesn't quite translate. It is closer to something like the place where the spirit power is present. It marks a location that has weight, that has to be treated a certain way, that requires care. Now the mountains. If you drive the interstate today, you see 3 great snow peaks along the Middle Columbia. To the south, Mount Hood. To the north, Mount Adams. Further west, Mount St. Helens. In English, they are named after 2 men who never saw them, a British admiral, Lord Hood, and a British diplomat, Lord St. Helens. Adams was renamed accidentally by a 19th century booster who thought a mountain in Washington ought to be named after an American president. The names are cheap, the names are almost embarrassing. In Ichishkeen and in the Klickitat traditions, the same mountains have older names. Mount Hood is Wyeast, Mount Adams is Pato, or Klickitat, Mount St. Helens is Luit, and Mount St. Helens has an even older name, Lawalaclough, which the Klickitat elders translated for early ethnographers as Smoking Mountain, or the mountain that keeps fire. These are not decorative names, they are a lived cosmology. In documented Klickitat tradition, the 2 brothers Wyeast and Pato and the woman Luit are ancestors. They are related to the mountains, and they are the mountains. The stories about them are stories about the country. They explain why Mount Hood is symmetrical and why Mount Adams has a broken, sunken summit. They explain why the small volcano to the west smoked and threw ash long before 1980. They explain why the river ran where it did. This is a system of knowledge, not a bedtime story. A system. Here is what the oldest recorded fragments of the Klickitat account say, before Balch got hold of them, and before the tourist offices got hold of Balch. The Great One, whom the Chinook jargon called Sahale or Saghali, meaning above or up there, fixed the 2 brothers on opposite sides of Nchiwana, Wyeast to the south, Pato to the north. Between them, the bridge, so that families could pass. Under the bridge, or near it, a fire that never went out. The keeper of the fire was Luit. The brothers went to war. The bridge came down, fire fell into the river. The keeper fell too, and where each of them fell, a mountain rose, and each mountain shows what happened to its person. Pato bends his head to the south, toward the fallen keeper, because Mount Adams has an eroded northern summit and slopes down toward Mount St. Helens. Wyeast lifts his head in pride because Mount Hood has a sharper, more symmetrical peak. Luit is beautiful and young and volatile, because Mount St. Helens was, until 1980, a near-perfect white cone, and because Mount St. Helens does what young volcanoes do, which is smoke. This is not myth in the sense of a lie. This is memory encoded as geography. Every element of the story matches something you can drive to and see. That is what the Klickitat knew. Now let's talk about what happened when the outsiders came. October of 1805. William Clark, second in command of the Corps of Discovery, was floating downriver in a dugout canoe with a company of men who had crossed a continent. They had been on the water for 4 days, coming down from Celilo Falls. The current was strong. The gorge, in Clark's word, was horrible in the sense that fills a 19th century American man with the kind of respect that borders on fear. On the 30th of October, they came around a bend, and Clark saw something that stopped him. He wrote in his journal for that day, and I'm giving you his exact spelling because he wrote fast in a canoe with a wet quill. This part of the river resembles a pond partly dreened, leaving many stumps bare both in and out of the water, current about 1 mile per hour. Read that again. Many stumps, bare, both in and out of the water. Clark was floating over the drowned forest. He was floating over the reservoir made by the fallen bridge, 3.5 centuries after it had come down. The water had cut a channel through the debris, but the debris was still there, and the trees killed by the flooding had not rotted yet. In cedar and Douglas fir, in cool water, submerged, a tree can hold its shape for 500 years. Longer. Clark noticed, but Clark did not ask. The next day, October 31st, they hit the rapids. Clark called them the Great Chute. He wrote of a place where the Columbia was compressed to 150 yards wide, dropping about 20 feet in half a mile, with water passing at great velocity, forming and boiling, in his phrase, in a most horrible manner. The Corps portaged their baggage along a narrow, slippery road 940 yards long, then lowered their canoes with ropes. It took 2 full days. They spent the whole time watched warily by the Watlala Chinookan villagers whose ancestral fishing site this was. The Watlala had been there long enough to have built a wooden portage economy around the rapids. They had been there since not long after the bridge fell. In Clark's account, they charged for the portage, because obviously they charged. It was a service. It had been a service for 200 years. Clark, being Clark, wrote them down as thieves. I want you to hold a specific image here. Clark, exhausted, muddy, in a canoe, floating past hundreds of black trunks standing upright in slow water, watching without asking, not asking anyone in the village what those trees were, not asking why, journaling and moving on, because if he had asked, they would have told him. 36 years later, in 1841, an American expedition under Charles Wilkes came through the Cascades and made the same observation. Trees standing in the river. Nobody asked yet. In 1847, the Canadian-born painter Paul Kane, working out of Toronto, arrived at the Cascades with a sketchbook. He was there for 2 days. He drew the fishing scaffolds. He drew the Watlala men taking tolls off passing boats. He drew, and this is important, the drowned forest itself. His sketches survive. You can see them in Canadian archives. He is the first white man on record who put the trees on paper for their own sake. Kane didn't quite know what he was looking at either, but he wrote something in his journal that hints at what he heard from local people. He mentioned that the Indians had a tradition of a great slide and a lake and a stone bridge. He didn't quite believe it. He wrote it down anyway. That is a pattern you see over and over again in the 19th century. A white traveler passes through. He sees the drowned forest. He hears the story from a Klickitat or Watlala or Wasco person. He thinks the story is romantic and probably exaggerated. He writes it down as folklore, and then he leaves. Nobody in that entire century took the story seriously enough to test it, except one man. And this is where our story turns, because he is also the man responsible for most of what got invented on top of it. Frederick Homer Balk was born in Lebanon, Oregon in 1861. His father held a law degree from Wabash College in Indiana, and later suffered a mental collapse and had to be sent to relatives back east. His mother raised the family. When Frederick was almost 10, they moved north across the Columbia to a farm near Goldendale, Washington, Klickitat country, Prairie People country, ex-Walk's Way Pam land. Balk had almost no formal schooling, maybe 6 months at Goldendale, maybe a few more at a place called Mount Tabor near Portland. He was self-taught. He read everything he could find. And from the age of about 10, he did something that in his generation was extremely unusual for a white settler boy. He went to the Klickitat elders. He sat in their lodges. He asked to hear their stories. He learned Chinook jargon, the trade pidgin that let him communicate. He wrote down what he heard. His sister Gertrude, who wrote about him years after his death, said no camp was too remote if at the end of it he thought he could find, in her phrase, an aged representative of some tribe with ancestral memory to share. Balk had a day job. He worked for the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, breaking rock for the roadbed. They were laying along the Oregon side of the Columbia. 10 hours of manual labor. Then he rowed home across the river to Lisle. Then he rode at night, by lamp, into the small hours. He worked on one book for most of his adult life. It came out in 1890, 1 year before he died of tuberculosis at the age of 29. It was called The Bridge of the Gods, a romance of Indian Oregon. And this is the pivot point. Because Frederick Homer Balk did 2 things at once, and it took a century to sort out which was which. The first thing he did was important and correct. He listened when nobody else was listening. He wrote down, in his preface, the story of the old man at White Salmon and the canoe going under the Tomanoas Bridge. He described the drowned forest. He wrote, and again I want to quote him because his prose is careful here. In the fall, when the freshets are over and the waters of the Columbia are clear, one going out in a small boat just above the Cascades and looking down into the transparent depths can see submerged forest trees beneath him, still standing upright as they stood before the bridge fell in and the river was raised above them. Balk believed the Klickitat elders were describing an actual event. He wrote, "By personal inquiry among old natives, he learned that the bridge which suggested the title of his romance was no fabric of the imagination, but was a great natural bridge that, in early days, spanned the Columbia." He was, in that sense, an early practitioner of what we now call geomythology, the discipline of reading oral tradition as a record of geological events. He was doing that before anyone had a name for it. That is Balk on his best day. That is Balk as a young man honestly hearing what an old man had to tell him. Then there's the other Balk, the novelist, the Victorian romance writer, the dying young man in Oakland, California in 1890, working on his book of the West, because The Bridge of the Gods is a novel. It is fiction. And in the fiction, Balk took the fragments he had heard, and he wrapped them in a plot borrowed from every romance of his period. He invented a heroic missionary from New England named Cecil Gray, who has a vision of a stone bridge over an unknown river, 3,000 miles from Boston, and who follows the vision west. He invented a doomed love affair between Cecil Gray and a Willamette princess named Wallula. He invented an alliance of tribes and a battle and a volcano and an earthquake that brings the bridge down at the exact climactic moment. And, most influentially, he took the mountain story he had heard in fragments in Klickitat lodges and rewrote it as a love triangle in the mode of Sir Walter Scott. Two brothers competing for a maiden, their war leveling forests, their fire falling into the river, the maiden as guardian of a sacred flame, a great father god who punishes them by turning them into mountains. Some of that is genuinely from the Klickitat tellings. Some of it is Balk, reaching for the shape of a story a 19th century American reader would recognize. Here is what the elders, in the earliest recorded fragments before Balk, actually seem to have said. Two brothers, ancestors of the peoples on either side of the river, quarreling, a bridge falling, fire coming out of the earth, the three peaks appearing where three figures fell. That is the bone structure. That is the memory. Here is what Balk added, and what got added by later writers riding on Balk's coattails. He added the specific romance plot. He added the syrupy character of the wise old woman guardian who is granted eternal youth by a great chief and who tends a sacred fire under the arch. He added stylized dialogue in a kind of pidgin English that no Klickitat person actually spoke. He gave the Great Spirit an Algonquian name, Manito, borrowed from Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha of 1855. Manito is not a Sahaptin word. Manito is a word from the Great Lakes, thousands of miles away, that Longfellow had made famous in a poem set among a different people entirely. Balch used it because his readers would recognize it. That is not evidence. That is marketing. And here is where you have to be careful. Balk wrote his editions with the sincerity of a young man who thought he was preserving a dying culture. He was not a cynic. He wasn't trying to defraud anyone. But he was writing a romance for a market. He needed a heroine. He needed a love triangle. He needed a mystical old woman. He needed a name for the great spirit that Boston book buyers would find picturesque. He gave his readers what they wanted. He put it in the mouths of Klickitat elders who had never said any of it. And then, 1 year after publication, he died. If Balch had lived, he might have written a second, more careful book. He might have separated the anthropology from the fiction. He didn't get the chance. What was left was the novel. And the novel became the source. Between 1890 and about 1920, if you were an editor at a magazine like Overland Monthly or Sunset, and you needed a piece of local color for your Pacific Northwest issue, where did you go? You went to Balch. If you were a hotel in Portland writing a brochure about the beauty of the Columbia Gorge, and you needed a native legend to spice it up, where did you go? You went to Balch. If you were a school teacher in Oregon in 1910 looking for a native story to teach to fourth graders, you found Balch on the library shelf, and you rewrote him. By the 1920s, the novel version had almost entirely displaced the actual Klickitat account. Catherine Berry Judson, a Seattle librarian, published a book in 1910 called Myths and Legends of the Pacific Northwest. And she took Balk's version wholesale, cleaned up the dialogue, and printed it as a Klickitat legend without qualification. Her book was reprinted across the 20th century. It sat in every school library in Washington and Oregon for 80 years. Generations of children learned the Balk version and thought they were learning what the Klickitat elders had said. Meanwhile, the Cascade Locks Portage Railroad opened in 1882. And then the Cascade Locks and Canal was completed in 1896, and then the modern Bridge of the Gods, the steel truss automobile bridge that stands today, was opened in 1926. And every one of those projects needed marketing. The railroad wanted passengers, the canal wanted freight, the bridge wanted tolls, and they all reached for the same story, the romantic story, the one with the love triangle, the one with the maiden. The steel bridge itself was given the name Bridge of the Gods, almost as a slogan. It commemorated, the promotional material said, the ancient native legend of the natural bridge that had once stood there. And the legend they cited was, almost word for word, Balka's novel of 1890. There's a strange loop in this. The natural stone bridge was real. The Klickitat memory of it was real. The old man at White Salmon and his father in the canoe were real. Balk heard something real. But what Balch shaped, and what everyone after Balch cited, was mostly Balch. The tourist industry in the Columbia Gorge is now built on a legend where the real bones underneath are Klickitat and the romantic upholstery on top is a young missionary's son writing feverishly in a rented room in Oakland, California. By the middle of the 20th century, the situation was almost circular. Tour guides on the excursion boats would tell passengers a legend they had learned from a pamphlet, which had been drawn from a magazine article, which had drawn from Judson, who had drawn from Balch, who had drawn, in part, from a real Klickitat oral tradition that had itself been simplified and shortened in translation. The living Klickitat and Yakama elders who could have corrected any of this were rarely asked. That is where the science comes in. Here is where the story turns for the third time, and I think this is the part almost nobody outside the region knows. In the summer of 1934, a graduate student in botany at Johns Hopkins University, a Portland native named Donald Culross Lawrence, came home for a research trip. He had heard about the drowned forest. He was working on his doctorate in the field of ecological succession. He was interested in dead trees, and he knew that Bonneville Dam was already under construction downstream, and that when the dam closed, the entire section of the river he wanted to study was going to be under 60 additional feet of water forever. He had a few years. Lawrence and his wife Elizabeth spent the falls of 1934 and 35 in a small boat above the Cascade Rapids at low water, mapping the drowned forest. This is a moment I want you to picture, because it will not happen again. Bonneville Dam closed in 1938, and after that, the trees are inaccessible under the deep pool of the reservoir. The 1930s were the last window. Lawrence and Elizabeth used the window. They counted, mapped, and photographed more than 1,800 submerged trees. They noted the exact depth of the lowest ones, at 33.5 feet above sea level, which was, importantly, roughly the same as the modern high flood stage of the Columbia below the rapids. That measurement told Lawrence something specific. It told him that the trees had been alive at a time when the river's normal water level in this stretch was much lower than the level after the landslide. In other words, the trees had drowned when the water rose. They had not been growing at the bottom of a lake. They had been growing on a floodplain, and something had raised the water abruptly and killed them. Lawrence tried to date the event. He was working before radiocarbon dating existed. He tried dendrochronology, matching ring patterns between the dead submerged trees and the oldest living trees on the landslide debris nearby. He couldn't complete the match, but he did establish that 4 out of 6 sampled trees had died in the same year. All of them at once, suddenly, together. That is the fingerprint of a mass drowning event, not gradual death from disease, not slow ecological change. A single year, a single event, a whole forest killed. Then Lawrence went up onto the landslide itself, onto the scar on the south side of Table Mountain, on the Washington bank of the river. He looked at the oldest tree growing on the slide debris. He counted its rings. It had germinated in about 1562. So the slide had to have happened before that, some amount of time before, long enough for soil to form, long enough for a Douglas fir to root and start ringing years. He filed the samples away. He wrote a preliminary paper. And then, in 1958, 20 years after Bonneville Dam had drowned the trees again, he did something the 1930s had not made possible. He submitted 2 of his old samples to the new technique of radiocarbon dating, then only 10 years old, and he and his brother Elmer published the results in the journal Mazama, the Portland-based Mountaineering Club's publication, in an article titled Bridge of the Gods Legend, Its Origin, History, and Dating. The result, in 1958, was rough but revolutionary. The forest had died sometime in the mid-second millennium. The Klickitat story was consistent with a real geological event. It was not folklore. It was memory. That was a moment. Nobody paid much attention. It was buried in a small journal that mountaineers read. But the science was on the record. Then, over the following 6 decades, that science got sharper. In the 1990s and early 2000s, geologists working with United States Geological Survey funding used improved radiocarbon dating and new dendrochronological methods on new samples of drowned trees and on trees killed by burial inside the landslide itself. They dated the trees at Wyeth, at Perham Creek, at a specimen they called the powerhouse tree that had been excavated during the 1970s construction of Bonneville Dam's second powerhouse, and they cross-checked all of it. The result, published in Quaternary Research and in Oregon Historical Quarterly in the 2000s and refined further in 2022, is this. The Bonneville landslide happened sometime between the year 1421 and the year 1455. 3 sigma confidence interval. That is roughly 1538 years ago, plus or minus a decade or two. 1450, half a century before Columbus reached the Bahamas. That was when the mountain fell. And the second thing the science determined was this. Yes, the landslide had temporarily closed the river completely. Yes, the water rose behind the debris to a height of about 200 to 240 feet. Yes, a lake formed and stretched upstream, perhaps as far as Wallula Gap, about 170 miles inland. Yes, the trees along the sides of that lake drowned all in the same year. Yes, eventually, over some number of months or a few years, the river overtopped the dam, cut a new channel through the southeastern edge of the debris, and left behind the rocky, foaming Cascade Rapids that Lewis and Clark called the Great Chute. That is the geology. That is the confirmed physical event. And here is what the science almost never says out loud, but implicitly confirms. Someone was there. The Klickitat memory of a bridge you could walk across, of a lake behind it, of the water rising, of the fire, of the mountains changing shape, of the bridge coming down. That memory is not general folklore about a distant mythic time. It is, based on the geological dating, a memory of a specific event in the 15th century that was witnessed by human beings whose descendants told the story until 1920th century radiocarbon labs proved them right. 500 years of oral history, and every major geological claim in it so far has held up. Take a breath there. Sit with that. Because I want you to understand what it means to be told for 100 years that your people's stories are cute, primitive, quaint. And then to have a laboratory in Oregon come back in the late 1950s and say your ancestors were describing a real landslide, then to have another laboratory come back in the 2020s and pin the year down to inside a 34-year window in the 15th century. Your grandmother's story, holding on precise instruments. That is what the Klickitat said was beneath the Columbia River. Not a princess, not a maiden, not a sacred flame guarded by an old woman granted eternal life by a great chief called Manito. That last version, the one every visitor center still sells, is Frederick Homer Balk and Catherine Berry Judson and the Cascade Locks Chamber of Commerce. The real thing beneath the river was a forest, and behind the forest, and the story that carried it, was proof. Now let me take you back to something, because I promised you I would. Remember the boy in the canoe, his mother paddling, the stone above, the darkness. Even that, when I first read it, I wanted to be a scene from Balch's novel. It has the shape of one. And Balch is the one who recorded it, in his preface in 1890 in Oakland, California, months before he died. Here's what I have to be honest about. We do not know if that testimony is a memory of the natural bridge that fell in 1450, still standing in remnant form as an arch for a while before it eroded away. We do not know if the old man's father actually paddled under it. It is possible. Radiocarbon dating shows the bridge came down as a walkable landform between 1421 and 1455, but there is evidence that fragments of it may have persisted in some form for longer, arch-like, before erosion took them out. The account is at the edge of what we can prove. What we can say is that the elders were describing something specific. The old man was not repeating Balch. The old man was speaking before Balch published. The old man's father, if he was a boy in, say, the 1750s, was speaking before any European had set eyes on the Cascades. There is a chain of testimony there that reaches, hand over hand, back into a time when no white person had touched the story. I want to be careful with that boy, because he is exactly the kind of detail the tourism industry loves to embellish. I will not embellish it. I will say what Balch said, and let it stand where it stands. We do not know his name. We know he existed. We know somebody was afraid of the dark under the stone. Whether the arch he passed under was the last remnant of the Tamanawas Bridge, or a smaller stone feature further downstream, or something else entirely, is a question the record does not close. Now consider what came next. The bridge, whatever remained of it, is gone. The Cascade Rapids that replaced it, the rapids Lewis and Clark shot in the Great Chute, are gone too. Bonneville Dam, closed in 1938, raised the water 44 feet and drowned the whole reach. The steel truss automobile bridge, called the Bridge of the Gods, was itself raised in 1938 to accommodate the new water level. Now, if you drive across it, you cross about 140 feet above a slow, quiet reservoir. Underneath you is where the rapids were. Underneath the rapids is where the debris was. Underneath the debris is where the forest was. Underneath the forest, in ash and basalt further down, is the older river before any of this happened. The Klickitat story is a story about a river that has been drowned twice, once by a mountain falling in 1450, once by a concrete dam in a federal work project in 1938. Both drownings covered evidence. Both drownings created new economies on top of the old ones. The 1938 drowning also finally hid the trees Lawrence had spent 2 summers documenting, and pushed them into a depth from which no small boat above the rapids would ever see them again. There is a bitter symmetry in that. I want to close by putting you next to 2 objects. The first is a small pamphlet published by the Port of Cascade Locks in the mid-20th century and reprinted many times since. It gives the legend of the Bridge of the Gods in about 6 paragraphs. It names the Great Spirit Manito. It says he sent his 3 sons, Multnomah the warrior, Klickitat the totem maker, and Weiss the singer, down to earth. It describes a woman named Squaw Mountain who fell asleep at Klickitat's feet. It describes the guardian Luwit. It describes the fight and the fall and the maiden and the flame. Almost every specific in that pamphlet is either from Balke's novel, from Judson's rewrite of Balk, or from further garbling by later commercial writers. The word Manito is Algonquian, borrowed from Longfellow. The name Multnomah as a mountain is a 19th century Portland area invention, not a Klickitat tradition. The name Squaw Mountain is a slur that continues to appear on some maps of the region, although Washington and Oregon have both been renaming such features for years now. The idea of a maiden granted eternal youth is a Victorian narrative convention. The word totem maker is culturally misplaced entirely, because the Klickitat did not make totem poles. Totem poles are a northwest coast tradition of the Tlingit, Haida, and Kwakwaka'wakw peoples, hundreds of miles away on salt water. The Klickitat lived on prairies and rivers. They wove baskets. They did not carve totems. That pamphlet was, for most of a century, the version an ordinary American learned about what happened on the Columbia. Now the second object. It is a specimen number in the archive of a university herbarium, a piece of wood cut from a tree in the drowned forest above Cascade Rapids in 1934. Its rings show the tree was hundreds of years old when it died. Its outer ring is charred and abrupt, the way a ring gets when a tree drowns quickly in still water. Its dendrochronological signature has been matched to 2 other trees, one killed by direct burial in the landslide itself, and one drowned like it in the impounded lake. All 3 died in the same year. All 3, when radiocarbon dated using accelerator mass spectrometry between 2000 and 2022, converge on the same window, 1421 to 1455. That specimen is not a legend. It is not a romance. It is a piece of a tree that was standing on the banks of Inchaiwana when the northern mountain came down. Between the pamphlet and the specimen is where all of this lives. The ex-Walks-Wapam elders were right. They were right about the landslide. They were right about the lake. They were right about the bridge you could walk across, and about the rocks in the water afterward, and about the trees you could see under the surface in low fall water. All of it. Confirmed. They were also right about the mountains in the sense that matters. They said Pato and Wai-East and Luwit are ancestors, and that Luwit smokes and throws fire. Luwit blew her top on the 18th of May, 1980, and killed 57 people and flattened 230 square miles of Washington. The Klickitat name for that mountain has meant Smoking Mountain for as long as any linguist has been writing it down. That name is a warning. It has been a warning for centuries. The United States Geological Survey put out a bulletin in 1978, 2 years before the eruption, saying an eruption was possible in the near future. The Klickitat name had been saying that in Ichishkin since long before there was a United States Geological Survey. What the tourism industry took out of the Klickitat account was almost everything true. What it put in was almost everything false. A love triangle, a jealous suitor, a maiden granted eternal youth, a soft, romantic, safely picturesque tragedy suitable for a hand-painted mural in a hotel lobby. The Klickitat account was not romantic. It was a record. It described a mountain falling into a river, a lake forming behind it, a river cutting a new channel, a forest drowning, and the country changing shape. It told the descendants exactly what had happened to the land they were living on, and it told them accurately enough that radiocarbon dating 5 centuries later would come back and agree. The tourism version tells you a story about a girl. You can decide, standing on that steel truss bridge above the water at Cascade Locks, which of those you want to believe your grandchildren. One last time, back to the boy. Balch rode him down. A boy in a canoe with his mother on Inchaiwana, passing under the stone. The roof of it blocking the sky. Dark, the canoe moving fast. His mother's paddle in the water. His fear, the instruction never to forget. You do not know his name. You do not know his mother's name. You know what he saw, and what he saw is not the ornament. It is the entire thing. The Klickitat people are still here. They are still on the Yakama Reservation and at Grand Ronde. They still speak the language they call Ichishkin. They still fish. When the seasons allow, on the river they still call Inchaiwana. Their stories are still being taught to their grandchildren. And the specimens of the drowned forest are still sitting in wooden cabinets at the University of Minnesota and elsewhere, where Donald Lawrence deposited them almost 100 years ago. Every one of those things is real. Every one of them was in the story long before the story was interesting to anyone else. If you drive across the Bridge of the Gods today at low sun, and you park at the eastern end, and you walk down to the water, you will not see the forest. It is too deep now. It has been under the Bonneville Pool for 87 years. Sonar surveys pick it up. Divers who have gone down for engineering work sometimes report the trunks, ghost white, still upright in the mud. But if you close your eyes and you listen to the current under the bridge, you can hear the version of the river that was there before the dam. Under that, the version that was there before the rapids. Under that, the version that was there before the mountain fell. And behind all of it, if you know to listen, you can hear an old man at White Salmon in the 1880s telling a young stranger the story his father told him about the day the sun disappeared under the stone. That is what the Klickitat said was beneath the Columbia River. They said the past was down there, and the past, as it turns out, was exactly where they said it was.